His name was Elias Cormac, though most people along the coast simply called him Old Cormac, even back when he wasn't old at all. It was the kind of name that seemed to belong to him before he'd earned it. The way some men are simply born looking like they've always known the sea. He lived alone in a gray clapboard house at the very end of Harrow Point, where the road stopped being a road and became just a suggestion of gravel leading down to the dock. The house had been his father's, and his father's father's before that, and each generation had added a little to it and taken a little away, the way the tide does to a shoreline, until what remained was something that belonged more to the weather than to any single man. Every morning, long before the sun had made up its mind whether it would appear at all, Elias would wake without an alarm. He never needed one. His body had learned, over some 60-odd years, to open its eyes exactly 4 minutes before the kettle on the stove would have started to whistle. Had he lit it the night before, which he never did, because he liked the walk to the kitchen in the dark, the floorboards knew his weight. They creaked in the same 3 places they always creaked, like old friends clearing their throats before a conversation. He would fill the kettle from the tap, watching the water catch just a little moonlight through the window above the sink, and set it on the stove, and stand there, not thinking of much, just standing, while the fog outside pressed itself gently against the glass like something that wanted to come in and warm its hands. Fog was a permanent resident of Harrow Point. It did not visit. It lived there, the way the pines lived there, the way the gulls lived there. Elias had long ago stopped thinking of it as weather at all. To him, the fog was simply the way the coast breathed. He would drink his tea standing at the window, watching the gray thicken and thin outside, listening for the first sounds of the harbor waking. Ropes creaking against pilings, the soft clunk of an oarlock somewhere down the row of boats, a gull, impatient, calling out to no one in particular. And then, when the tea was gone and the mug rinsed and set upside down on the towel by the sink, exactly as it always was, he would put on his boots, the left one first, always the left, and step out into the cold. The walk down to the dock took him past 6 other houses, all much like his own, though none of them had a light on yet. He liked being the first one awake. There is a particular kind of quiet that only exists in the hour before a fishing village stirs, and Elias had spent enough mornings inside that quiet to recognize its many small variations. The quiet before rain, the quiet before wind, the quiet, rarest of all, before a truly still day, when the water would lie so flat and silent that a man could believe, just for a moment, that the sea had fallen asleep too. This morning was one of the still ones. He noticed it the moment he came around the bend by the old fish house, its boards long since silvered by salt and years. The harbor lay before him like a sheet of dark glass, the fog resting just above its surface in slow, unhurried coils, neither rising nor falling, simply existing there, the way breath hangs in cold air. His boat, the Constance II, sat at her mooring exactly where he had left her the evening before, her hull rocking so gently it was almost imperceptible, a small, patient movement, like something breathing in its sleep. He had named her after his wife, not the first asterisk Constance. That boat, older and smaller, had been sold decades ago to a young fisherman from up the coast who needed a first boat of his own and hadn't had the money for a new one. Elias sometimes wondered still whether that boat was still out there somewhere, under some other name now perhaps, still doing what boats do, indifferent to the memories it had once carried. Constance herself had been gone 11 years. He did not think of this every morning. That would have been too much, too heavy a thing to carry down to the dock each day. But some mornings, the still ones, the quiet ones, the ones where the fog sat just so on the water, he would think of her without quite meaning to. The way you might suddenly remember the smell of a room you haven't stood in for years. She used to wake before him, actually. That was something people rarely believed when he told them, because everyone assumed the fisherman's wife slept in while the fisherman rose in the dark. But Constance had loved mornings more than he did, and in their 31 years together, she had beaten him to the kitchen more often than he cared to admit. Asterisk, you'll miss this fog one day, she told him once, years ago, standing exactly where he was standing now, her hands wrapped around a mug of her own, her breath rising to join the gray around them. When you're too old to walk down here, you'll miss it something terrible. Asterisk, he had laughed at her then, told her he'd never tire of fog, not in 100 years, because a man who tires of fog is a man who has stopped paying attention. She had smiled the way she always smiled when she knew something he didn't yet. He missed her most on mornings like this. The Constance II had been built by his own hands over 2 long winters in the shed behind the house, using oak he had cut and cured himself and fittings he had saved for a decade to afford. She was not a large boat, 32 feet, single cabin, a modest wheelhouse, just big enough for 2 people if they didn't mind standing close. But she was solid in the way that mattered, built by someone who understood that a boat's real job was not to look beautiful, but to bring a man home again, every single time, no matter what the water decided to do that day. He stepped aboard the way he always did, one hand finding the gunwale without needing to look, his boots finding the deck in the dark from 30 years of memory rather than sight. The engine, when he turned the key, coughed once, twice, and then settled into its familiar low murmur. a sound so constant in his life that he sometimes forgot to notice it at all. The way you forget to notice your own heartbeat. He did not leave the harbor right away. This was another of his habits, one that had confused a few of the younger fishermen who sometimes worked alongside him on the larger boats out of necessity. He would sit, engine idling, for anywhere between 2 and 10 minutes, simply looking at the water, not checking instruments, not reviewing charts, just looking, reading the fog, he called it, when anyone bothered to ask. There was a way the fog moved on a good day, and a different way it moved on a day when a man ought to stay closer to shore. There was a texture to it, a thickness, a particular gray that meant one thing, and a slightly different gray that meant another. He could not have explained this to anyone who had not spent 40 years watching it. It was not knowledge so much as it was familiarity, the kind of understanding that lives in the hands and the eyes rather than in words. Tonight, or this morning rather, though the two blurred together so easily at this hour, the fog was moving the good way, slow, even, undisturbed by any wind worth worrying over. He eased the asterisk Constance Roman 2 asterisk out of her mooring and pointed her bow toward the harbor mouth, toward the wider water beyond, where the buoy bell rang softly in the distance, its sound flattened and rounded by the fog, until it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Behind him, the village of Harrow Point began slowly to wake. A light came on in the Whitfield house. Smoke began to curl from the Doyle chimney. Somewhere, a dog barked twice, and then thought better of it. Ahead of him lay the gray, and the water, and the long, quiet hours of the morning, waiting the way they always waited, patient as the tide. He throttled forward gently and let the harbor fall away behind him. There is a particular silence that exists half a mile offshore in fog before the sun has risen. It is not the absence of sound. The world is never entirely without sound, not even here. It is, rather, a narrowing of sound, as though someone has taken the whole wide orchestra of the world and left only a few careful instruments playing, spaced far apart, so that each one can be heard clearly on its own. The soft chug of the engine, the occasional slap of water against the hull. Far off, muffled by distance and moisture, the buoy bell, tolling every few seconds in a rhythm that belonged to no music but its own. Elias had long ago made peace with this silence. Many men could not. He remembered the ones, over the years, who had come out with him a handful of times, nephews, sons of friends, a schoolteacher from the mainland who had wanted, for one summer, to see what real work looked like, and how most of them had fidgeted after the first 20 minutes of quiet, reaching for words the way a man reaches for a blanket on a cold night, simply because the silence made them uneasy. He never minded their talking, exactly, but he always noticed, quietly, How few of them lasted more than a season or two before deciding the sea wasn't for them after all. It was not the labor that drove them off, in most cases. It was the quiet. Men who could not sit with their own thoughts, he had come to believe, could not sit with the sea either, because the sea would not do the work of filling that silence for them. It simply waited, the way it always waited, for a man to either make peace with himself or turn back toward shore. He guided the boat out toward Marrow's Ledge, a shallow shelf of rock some 3 miles out, where the lobster tended to gather this time of year. Following a course so familiar to him that he barely needed to glance at the compass mounted beside the wheel. 40 years of these waters had drawn a map inside him that no chart could improve upon, not the rocks and shoals as they appeared on paper, but as they felt, as they sounded, as the particular quality of the swell changed subtly beneath the hull when he passed near Widow's Rock, or the way the fog seemed to thin, almost imperceptibly, as he crossed the deeper channel south of the ledge. He thought, as he often did on these mornings, about nothing in particular, and everything at once. That was the strange gift of these hours. The mind was permitted, out here, to wander wherever it liked, unburdened by the need to arrive anywhere. He thought of the traps waiting for him at the ledge, 17 of them set 2 days prior, and wondered idly what they might hold. He thought of the weather, and whether the still morning might give way to wind by afternoon, the way it sometimes did this time of year. He thought briefly, and without much sadness now, of Constance, and of the small garden she used to keep behind the house, and of how he still, 11 years on, could not bring himself to plant anything in it himself, content instead to let it grow wild and green and unruly, because somehow that felt more honest than trying to recreate what she alone had known how to make. The bell buoy grew louder as he passed it, close enough now to see its shape rising dimly out of the fog. A dark, swaying silhouette, rust-red beneath the gray paint, rocking gently on the swell, its bell tolling with each small motion in a rhythm that had marked this stretch of water for as long as Elias could remember, and long before that too. The traps came up slow, the way Elias always brought them up, hand over hand on the line, rather than trusting the hauler to do the thinking for him. He had a hauler bolted to the rail, of course, same as every boat his size, but he only used it when his shoulders demanded it, which happened more often now than it used to, though he would never have admitted that to anyone who asked. The first trap broke the surface dripping and heavy with weed, a long trailing beard of kelp hanging from its wire frame, and inside, moving with the slow, indignant patience of a creature that has had a great deal of time to consider its situation, sat 2 lobsters, one clearly a keeper, the other too small, its shell still soft and pale at the joints. He worked without hurrying. There was no reason to hurry. The small one went back over the side with a soft splash, sinking quickly out of sight into water the color of strong tea. The keeper went into the crate, and the trap, rebaited with a fresh chunk of herring from the bucket at his feet, went back over, the coiled line paying out after it with a sound like a long, slow exhale. He did this 17 times. Some traps held nothing at all, just water and weed, and the ghost-pale shapes of small crabs that scuttled sideways off the wire mesh the moment the trap broke the surface, as though embarrassed to have been found there. Others held 2 or 3 lobsters at once, a small crowded gathering that always made him think, briefly, and without much depth to the thought, of a family sitting down together at a table too small for all of them. The fog had not lifted by the time he reached the last trap. If anything, it had settled lower, thick enough now that the shoreline, 3 miles behind him, had become nothing more than an idea, a direction he trusted rather than a place he could see. The buoy bell had faded to almost nothing behind him too, its tolling swallowed somewhere in the gray. This did not worry him. A man who had fished these waters for 40 years did not need to see the shore to know where it was. He had a compass, and he had the set of the current beneath the hull, and he had, more than either of those things, a kind of knowing that lived somewhere below conscious thought. The same knowing that let him find his own front door in the dark, or the particular stair that always creaked, without ever once having to think about where his feet ought to go. He finished the last trap and coiled the line at his feet. And then, as he did most mornings once the work was done, and before he turned the asterisk constants Roman 2 asterisk back toward home, he allowed himself to simply sit. He settled onto the overturned bait bucket by the stern, his knees complaining faintly, the way knees do after 60-some years of standing on wet decks, and he let his eyes rest on the fog without really looking at anything in particular. This was, if he was honest with himself, his favorite part of the day. Not the catching, though he took a quiet satisfaction in that too. Not even the returning home, though that had its own comforts. It was this, the sitting, the stillness, the fog pressing close around the small, warm circle of the boat, as though the asterisk constants II were the only solid thing left in the entire world, and everything beyond her rail had simply dissolved into gray, he thought, in these moments of very little. This was not emptiness, exactly. It was something closer to rest, the kind of rest that does not require sleep, only permission. The permission to stop reaching for the next thought, the next task, the next thing that needed doing, and simply exist for a while inside the fog and the gentle rock of the swell and the far-off, half-imagined sound of a gull, somewhere he could not see, he thought, sometimes, that this was as close to prayer as he had ever come. He had never been a especially religious man. Constance had gone to the little white church at the top of the hill most Sundays, and he had gone with her more often than not, though more for her company than for any conviction of his own. But out here in the fog, with the traps pulled and the engine idling low and patient beneath him, he understood in some wordless way what people meant when they spoke of feeling small in a good way. Not diminished, not unimportant, simply small, the way a stone is small against a mountain, and finding in that smallness a kind of peace that nothing on land had ever quite managed to offer him. The fog began to thin, finally, sometime after 8, the way it usually did once the sun had climbed high enough to begin working on it in earnest. It did not lift all at once. It thinned in patches, revealing, for a moment, a stretch of gray-green water some 50 yards off the bow, before closing again like a curtain drawn back, and then let fall. Through one such gap, Elias caught sight of another boat, far off, little more than a dark shape against the lighter gray behind it. He knew, without needing to see her name painted on the bow, that it would be the Marion asterisk, out of the harbor at Cutter's, cove 2 coves over, worked these days by a young man named Thomas Prout, who had taken over the boat from his father 3 years back, after the elder Prout's hands had finally given out from decades of rope and cold. Elias lifted a hand in a slow wave, more from habit than any real expectation of being seen, and a moment later, faintly, he heard the answering call of the Marion S horn, 2 short blasts, the fisherman's way of saying I see you, and I wish you well before the fog closed again and swallowed the other boat whole. He smiled faintly at that. There was a fellowship among the boats out here that he had never quite been able to explain to people from away. A sense that despite the solitude, despite the miles of empty water between one hull and the next, none of them were ever truly alone out here. They were bound together by something older than radio or friendship, something closer to the old sailors, understanding that the sea did not much care whose boat it was. And so the boats, in turn, looked out for one another in whatever small ways they could. He started the engine forward again, turning the Constance, Roman 2 S bow back toward Harrow Point, back through the thinning fog, back toward the harbor, where, by now, the whole village would be awake and moving through the ordinary business of its ordinary Tuesday. The time he tied off at the dock, the sun had made a half-hearted appearance, a pale coin low in the sky. Its light filtered so thoroughly through the remaining haze that it cast no real shadows, only a general softening of the gray into something a shade warmer. He unloaded the crate of lobsters, 19 keepers in the end, a decent morning's work. Nothing spectacular, but nothing to complain of either, and carried it up to the small weathered shed at the top of the ramp, where Del Ashworth kept his scales and his tank, buying from most of the boats that fished out of Harrow Point, and selling on to the trucks that came through twice a week bound for Rays. There are mornings when a man knows, before he has even opened his eyes, that the day ahead will not be like the ones before it. Elias Cormac woke to one such morning in late November, some weeks after the still gray dawn, when he'd pulled his traps at Marrow's Ledge and walked home past the same 6 houses he had passed nearly every day of his adult life. He knew it before the kettle, before the boots, before even the first gray light had found its way through the kitchen window. He knew it the way his father had taught him to know it, and his father's father before that, not through any single sign, but through the sum of many small ones, gathered together into a feeling that lived somewhere behind the ribs, rather than in the eyes or ears. The air had a different weight to it this morning, heavier somehow, though nothing had visibly changed. The floorboards, when he stepped onto them, felt cooler than they had the day before, and the old brass barometer that hung in the hallway, a gift from Constance's father decades ago, and kept faithfully ever since, had dropped low enough overnight that Elias paused in front of it a long moment, reading the small dial the way another man might read a letter bearing unwelcome news. He did not need the barometer to tell him what he already felt in his knees and his shoulders, in the particular ache that gathered in old injuries whenever the weather meant to turn serious. But he read it anyway, out of habit, out of respect for an instrument that had never once lied to him in 40 years of consultation. Asterisk, storm coming, asterisk, he thought, standing there in the dim hallway. A real one this time, not just wind and rain. Asterisk, he had heard nothing on the radio the evening before to suggest anything more than a passing squall, the kind that blew through 2 or 3 times a month this time of year, and amounted to little more than a wet, uncomfortable morning on the water. But radios, Elias had learned across a long life on this coast, were only ever as good as the men reading the instruments far away in cities that had never once felt the particular quality of fog rolling in off Marrow's Ledge, and a fisherman's own body, tuned by decades of mornings, just like this one, often knew things the radio would not catch, until it was already too late to matter. He dressed with more care than usual, layering wool beneath his oilskins, and made his tea standing at the window, as he always did, though this morning he watched not the fog, for there was, he noticed, less fog than usual, the air too restless and unsettled to hold it properly in place. But the sky itself, where a strange, low bank of cloud had gathered along the eastern horizon, dark and heavy-bellied, moving with a speed that told him everything the barometer had not needed to the walk down to the harbor felt different this morning too. The wind, though still gentle, had a restlessness to it that the still mornings never carried, tugging at the hem of his coat, rattling faintly the loose shutter on the old fish house that no one had gotten around to fixing in the 3 years since it had first worked loose. He found Del Ashworth already at the dock, earlier than usual, standing with his hands in his pockets and his eyes fixed on that same dark bank of cloud along the horizon. And Elias understood, without either of them needing to say a word, that Del had felt the same change in the air that he had, "You going out?" Del asked, when Elias came alongside him. "Thinking on it," Elias said. "Traps have been out 3 days already. Ought to check them at least, even if I don't stay long." Del said nothing for a long moment, his eyes still on the horizon, where the dark cloud bank had grown, even in the short time they had stood there, noticeably closer, noticeably taller, its edges beginning to show the particular ragged, boiling quality that Elias had learned across decades to take seriously. "Weather report still says nothing till tonight," Del said finally, though his tone carried little conviction in the report itself. "Weather report's wrong," Elias said simply, and Del, who had known Elias Cormack for the better part of 4 decades, and had learned over that time to trust the older man's read of the sky over any report broadcast from the mainland, only nodded slowly and said, "Don't stay out long then." "Wasn't planning to." Thomas Prout arrived a few minutes later, the young man's face carrying the particular tightness of someone who had also read the sky and did not entirely like what he'd found there. He and Elias exchanged a few brief words, an agreement more implicit than spoken, that both of them would keep half an eye on the other's boat should the weather turn faster than either expected. And then the 2 men parted ways toward their separate vessels, the Asterisk Marion and the Constance II, both riding low and steady at their moorings, patient as always, unaware, in whatever way a boat can be said to be unaware, of what the day might have in store for them. Elias stepped aboard the Asterisk Constance II with the same familiar motion he had used 10,000 times before, one hand finding the gunwale without needing to look, and turned the key and let the engine settle into its low murmur beneath him. But this morning, he did not sit as long as he usually sat, reading the fog. There was no fog worth reading this morning, only that dark, restless sky and a wind that had begun, even in the few minutes since he'd left the house, to carry a harder edge than it had carried at dawn. He eased the boat out of her mooring and pointed her bow toward the harbor mouth, moving with more purpose than his usual unhurried mornings, though not yet with anything like haste. There was, he had learned across 60-some years, a very particular difference between moving with purpose and moving in fear, and a man who let the second masquerade as the first was, more often than not. A man who made poor decisions on the water beyond the harbor mouth had already begun to show the storm's approach, the swell rising in long, restless heaves that had not been there 3 days before. When Elias had last set his traps in water so calm it had seemed, for a while, to have forgotten the very concept of weather entirely. He kept the Constance Roman II *S bow angled carefully into the swell, the old boat handling it the way she had always handled everything he'd asked of her across the many years, since he'd built her with his own 2 hands. Steady, dependable, unbothered by conditions that might have unsettled a lesser vessel. The sky continued its slow, ominous darkening as he made his way out toward Marrow's Ledge, the dark cloud bank that had sat on the horizon at dawn, now climbing steadily overhead, swallowing the pale winter sun by degrees, until the whole world had taken on the flat, colorless quality of a day that could not decide whether it was still morning or had already surrendered to something closer to dusk. He thought, as he worked, of Constance, the way he often thought of her out here, though today the memory that came to him was not of comfort, but of caution. A memory of her voice, sharp with worry, from some storm many decades past, telling him, in no uncertain terms, that a man who loved his wife did not take foolish risks with weather that a barometer had already warned him about. You come home to me, she had told him more than once across their 31 years together, in that particular tone that brooked no argument. Whatever's out there, whatever the traps are worth, you come home to me. Nothing in that water is worth more than that. He had kept that promise every single time across a lifetime of storms and near storms and the ordinary uncertainties of a fisherman's working life. And though she was gone now, 11 years gone, he found that the promise had not weakened with her passing. If anything, it had grown sharper, more solemn, because there was no longer anyone waiting at the window to hold him accountable to it except himself, and a man's word to a woman who could no longer collect on it seemed, to Elias, an even more sacred thing than it had been before. He reached the first of his traps and hauled it quickly, efficiently, without the slow, contemplative pace of his usual mornings. The lobster inside, a single keeper, decent-sized, went into the crate without ceremony, and the trap went back over the side, though he did not linger to rebate it as carefully as he usually did. Time, this morning, was a resource to be spent carefully, not luxuriated in. He had pulled 9 of his 17 traps when the wind finally announced, in earnest, that the day's grace period had ended. It came first as a single hard gust, strong enough to rock the asterisk Constance II, sharply enough that Elias had to brace himself against the rail, and then, within minutes, as a steady, building howl that flattened the tops of the swells into long streaks of white spray and turned the sky, entirely now, into a low, churning ceiling of dark cloud that seemed to press down on the water like a hand closing slowly into a fist. Rain followed the wind, arriving not gently, but all at once. A hard, stinging rain that turned the world beyond the asterisk Constance, Roman 2 asterisk S, bow, into little more than a gray, roaring blur. Elias did not hesitate. He had made this calculation 100 times across a lifetime on this water. The exact moment when a man stopped being a fisherman, finishing his work, and became, instead, a man simply trying to get home. And he recognized that moment now with the same clear, unpanicked certainty that had kept him alive across 4 decades of exactly this kind of weather. He left the remaining 8 traps where they sat on the floor of Marrow's Ledge. They would keep. Traps were built to weather far worse than this, sitting patient and undisturbed on the seafloor while the storm raged above them. And there was no lobster in the world worth risking a man's life to collect in weather like this. He turned the asterisk Constance, Roman 2 asterisk S, bow toward home, and pushed the throttle forward, feeling the old boat respond the way she always responded, steady and sure beneath him, even as the swells grew steeper, and the wind tried, with increasing insistence, to shove her off her course. The visibility had dropped to almost nothing now, the rain and spray combining into a gray chaos that swallowed everything beyond perhaps 30 feet of water in any direction. But Elias did not need to see. 40 years of these waters had drawn a map inside him that no storm could erase. He knew, by the particular rhythm of the swell beneath the hull, by the compass mounted steady beside the wheel, by some deeper knowing that lived below conscious thought entirely, exactly where Harrow Point lay, and exactly how to get there. He thought, as he worked the wheel, steady hand against a wind that fought him for every degree of course, of that long ago January storm, of Constance waiting at the window, of the promise he had made her, and kept every single time since, was not afraid exactly. Fear was a luxury that clouded a man's thinking, and Elias had long since trained himself out of it in moments like this. But he was alert in every part of himself, present in a way that few other moments in life demanded, his whole being narrowed down to the single, simple task of bringing the asterisk Constance, Roman 2 asterisk, and himself safely home. The buoy bell reached him before the harbor mouth itself, came into view, its tolling wilder now, less patient, thrown about by a wind and swell that had turned even that steady, ancient marker into something closer to frantic. He followed the sound of it, the way sailors had followed such sounds for centuries before him, trusting his ears where his eyes could offer him nothing. The passage through the harbor mouth was the hardest part. The water there compressed and confused by the narrow channel, throwing the asterisk constants I about in ways the open water hadn't. Elias held the wheel with both hands, his whole body braced against the boat's pitching, his eyes fixed on the compass and on the faint, half-glimpsed shapes of the harbor markers as they emerged briefly from the gray before vanishing again. And then, all at once, the water calmed. Not entirely. The storm still raged around him. The rain still hammered down. The wind still howled through the rigging of every boat in the harbor. But the harbor itself, sheltered by the rise of land on either side, offered a mercy that the open water had not. And Elias felt the asterisk constants I settle beneath him into something closer to her ordinary, steady rhythm. He brought her alongside the dock through driving rain. Other figures already visible through the gray Dell, and Thomas Prout, and old Harlan himself, come down from his tavern despite his age to help however he could, hands reaching to catch lines. Voices raised against the wind in the particular, economical shorthand of men who had done this together many times before, and needed no more than a few shouted words to understand exactly what was required of them. Brutes in two, Dell shouted, as they worked together to secure the asterisk constants, Roman 2 asterisk S lines. Everyone's accounted for. You're the last one out past the ledge. Elias only nodded, saving his breath for the work at hand. And together, the small knot of men worked through the driving rain to see every boat in the harbor properly secured against a storm that had arrived faster and harder than any of the mainland reports had predicted. Chapter 6. Home through the storm, the walk up from the dock. Normally so unhurried, so familiar in every rut and stone, became, in the storm, something closer to battle. The wind driving the rain nearly sideways. The 6 houses along the lane barely visible through the gray. Their windows glowing faint and warm against the chaos outside. Elias reached his own gate soaked through despite his oilskins, the rain having found its way, as it always eventually did in weather like this, past every seam and collar a man could think to fasten. Constance's roses, he noticed even in passing, whipped wildly against the fence, their bare winter canes bending nearly flat under the force of the gusts. Though he knew, from long experience, that they would straighten again once the storm passed, patient and stubborn as everything else about that wild, untended garden Inside, he stripped off his soaked oilskins in the small mudroom off the kitchen. His hands, he noticed, only now beginning to shake slightly. Not from fear, not any longer, but from the simple physical toll of an hour spent bracing against wind and wave with every muscle in his body. He built a fire in the front room grate with more care and more urgency than he usually gave the task, and sat before it, wrapped in the same thick quilt Constance had made him their 5th winter together, listening to the storm rage on outside, rattling the shutters, driving the rain against the windows in great hissing sheets. He thought, sitting there, of that other storm, decades gone now, and of the young woman who had wrapped him in a blanket much like this one, and held him until the shivering stopped. He thought of the promise he had made her, and kept once again, today. I came home, he said quietly to the empty room, to the chair across from his own that had sat empty for 11 years now. Just like I told you I would. The fire crackled in answer, and the storm went on raging outside, and Elias Cormac sat there in the warmth and the quiet, safe and dry and entirely, gratefully alive, while somewhere out past Marrow's ledge, 8 traps sat patient and undisturbed on the dark seafloor, waiting, the way everything on this coast eventually learned to wait, for the storm to pass and the calm to return, exactly as it always, eventually, did. Chapter 7. The morning after the storm blew itself out sometime before dawn, the way the worst ones always did, exhausting themselves against the coast until only a steady, gentler rain remained. And then, by the time Elias woke to his kettle's imagined whistle, not even that, only a still, washed, silvery morning, the sky scoured clean of cloud, the harbor lying calm and glassy, as though the previous day's chaos had been nothing more than a fever dream. He walked down to the dock in that particular quiet that follows a storm, a hush deeper and more complete than even the quietest fog morning, the whole village seeming to hold its breath in gratitude that the night had passed without worse damage than a few loose shutters and one dinghy belonging to the Whitfield family, found the next morning a quarter-mile down the shore, undamaged but considerably displaced. The asterisk Constance, sat at her mooring exactly as he'd left her, patient and unbothered, as though she too understood that storms were simply another part of the long rhythm she had been built to weather. Elias stepped aboard and started her engine and pointed her bow once more toward Marrow's ledge to retrieve the 8 traps he had left behind the day before. He found them all, in the end, exactly where he had left them, undisturbed by the storm that had raged so violently above them. And as he hauled them up one by one into the calm, silvery morning, he found himself thinking, not of fear, and not even really of the storm itself, but simply of gratitude for the boat his own hands had built, for the 40 years of mornings that had taught him to read a sky before it turned dangerous, and for a promise made to a woman long gone, kept once more, on a coast that had asked him, across a whole long life, to be patient and careful and faithful to the people and the water both, in exactly the way he had always tried to be. The buoy bell tolled softly behind him as he turned for home, steady and unhurried once more, marking the tide the way it always had, the way it always would, long after this particular storm, and every storm still to come, had passed into memory, and then, eventually, into nothing at all but the quiet, unbroken rhythm of a coast that simply went on, morning after morning, being exactly what it had always been. Asterisk the end. Asterisk, asterisk crest now, if you haven't already. The storm has passed. The harbor is calm. There is nothing left to do but sleep.